Welcome to the second episode of This Week in Mappercraft. This past week was January 4th to January 10th, and we'll be covering the years of 2016, 2017, 2018, 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2025. As always, all information here can be found on the Mappercraft wiki. It is linked in the description along with the server itself. Let's go over the years. In 2016, the server was running Distorted Europe, hosted by Monsoon Jr., founder of Mappercraft. In 2017, the server was running Earthworld Mark V, one of the more impactful worlds in that series. In 2018, the server was running Distorted Europe Revived, hosted by Xenodyne, a return to the world from 2016. In 2020, the server was running Solus World 2, hosted by Solus, one of the more popular worlds. The server really grew during its lifespan. In 2021, the server was running VMJ World, hosted by Multi at the time, another really popular world despite the issues with multiple hosts. It ran the longest of any world on Mappercraft. In 2022, the server was running Brave New World, hosted by me, MintyMichael. First world I hosted, it was alright. In 2025, last year, the server was running Ramayana World, also hosted by me, one of the more recent worlds that was relatively popular. So, let's get right into it. From January 4th through the 10th, 2016, we have 3 events to cover, 2 on the 9th and 1 on the 10th. On the 9th of January 2016, the Bucket Crisis occurred. This was a minor dispute over the ownership of Scotland, which was occupied by someone named Josh. Apparently, Nano had declared independence from Scandinavia as Ireland. So he went over and tried to try and negotiate to see if Scotland wanted to join him or stay with Scandinavia. However, Scotland decided to try and join a third party, Trichia, instead. That pissed off both the Irish and Scandinavians, so they stole all of these Scottish buckets, hence the name of the crisis. Scotland tried to get Batran, the leader of Trichia, to intervene, but he refused. Here's the exact quote from the wiki. And this pretty much directly led to the second event on the 9th, the Scottish Massacre, in which Nano led a joint Irish-Scandinavian force to invade and occupy Scotland, repeatedly killing the inhabitants. Eventually, Batran threatened to get Trichia involved militarily, which ended the invasion and massacre. And here's the associated quote from the wiki. The last event is only somewhat related, but it does manage to tie this sort of Irish thing up really well. It is the Irish-Scandinavian conflict on the 10th of January 2016. It began when a Scandinavian diplomat was attacked and killed while in Ireland. Scandinavia immediately declared war. Trichia remained neutral despite their alliance with Scandinavia. Irish forces quickly invaded and annexed Scotland, but were eventually pushed back by the Scandinavian army. Ireland's invaded, eventually destroyed. Irish forces held out in Iceland while the Scandinavians attempted to siege them out. Eventually, Trichia intervened and a truce is declared. Batran negotiated for the Scandinavian side, and a peace treaty was signed in which Scandinavia got to keep Scotland, but allowed Ireland to take over the rest of England, since neither Scandinavia nor Trichia had claimed it. The conflict as a whole led to Trichia becoming a larger partner in their sort of personal union alliance between them and Scandinavia. So they were more able to control the policies and actions of that nation more directly. And here's the rather long quote about it from the wiki, which was probably written by Batran, so you should keep that in mind. And if you have more additional information about these events, please drop a comment below or go write it on the wiki. I don't really have a ton of information about this conflict. The quotes are pretty much what I have. This is a big year. We'll be going through 4 different events from January 4th and 5th, 2017, before we get to the second half of the week on the next slide. On the 4th of January, 2017, the First Starim-Eriga War began, usually referred to as World War II by the members of Starim. It was the defining war of late Earthworld 5, so much that the time periods before and after the war are referred to as the pre-war and post-war eras of the world. Following the events of the previous week, where Starum temporarily invaded the capital of Araga, Vask, Araga feared that they were planning to invade and thus decided to strike first. So they declared a surprise war on Starum on January 4th and quickly invaded, catching all of the Starimgillian forces by surprise. Here's the quote from the wiki. Following the declaration, the war was fought on the 4th via the 2 battles of Livonis and Vask. Livonis being the capital of Starum and Vask the capital of Araga. To start the war, the Aragans invaded Livonis and dealt some major damage. Starmiglian forces regrouped following the surprise attack, and after a short defense, managed to launch a counterattack on Vask. Here's the quote from the wiki, heavily sort of cut there. After large amounts of fighting in both cities, the server began to lag severely, and a ceasefire was declared. Negotiations began between both parties at this time, but ultimately the first round of peace talks broke down, and griefing restarted on both sides. Eventually, the leader of Araga, Tomad, agreed to come to the peace table, and this led to the signing of the Treaty of Helsinki on January 5th, 2017. Although the treaty was eventually signed by both Starum and Araga, the provisions of the treaty were not necessarily fulfilled. Starum demanded reparations from Araga, which were not necessarily paid off. I don't have specific details there. However, some of the other provisions were enforced. Starum gained some territory in Europe, and both nations were not allowed to go to war with each other for the rest of the world. The Starum population viewed this as a victory for them, despite the damage to Livonis, while the Aragans viewed the war as more of a stalemate, with major damage on both sides. As a result, the Aragans viewed the treaty as relatively unfair, as they were forced to pay reparations despite kind of holding their own against what was perceived as the strongest nation on the server at the time. International reactions to the war were mixed. Most minor nations remained neutral. The Kingdom of Maple supported Araga, while the PAU, the third strongest power in the world at the time, shifted its foreign policy over the course of the war. At the start, the PAU supported Araga despite their alliance with Starum, but eventually discontent from the Lapanian separatists led to the PAU officially changing their position to supporting Araga. I don't have any clear information either way about the PAU fighting in any of these battles. Here's the specific quote from the wiki. You can read a lot more about this war on a couple of different wiki pages if you'd like. It's definitely one of the more suspenseful moments in the server's history. Finally, the last event on the slide. Following the ending of the war, Extra took over leadership of Araga from Tomad in a controversial election on the 5th. After abdicating following the Treaty of Helsinki, Tomad held some sort of election to determine who should be the next leader. Although Imperial Saxon won the election, another member of his party, Extra, was appointed the new leader instead. Extra later appointed Tomad as the Chancellor of Araga, leading some people to dispute the election, but at the end of the day, Extra maintained their position of power and successfully took over the country. Here's the quote. On to the second half of the week, rest of the world, January 6th through the 10th, 2017. First, on the 6th, the PAU attempted to hold an election following a debate between several different parties. The 3 parties were the Priorist Party, led by King Kekap, which was a centrist and pacifist party, the Inuktitut Party, led by King Sikorsky, which was a monarchist and imperialist party, and the Adeningam Party, led by Starozeld, which was a leftist socialist party. The debate and subsequent straw poll election was controversial because it let foreigners participate and vote, leading to some question of its legitimacy. Interestingly, there's a pretty big contradiction on the wiki regarding the results. The official world history, which was written by Batran, a member of Starum, claims that the election was cancelled as a result of foreign interference, while the PAU page, written by Sikorsky, claims that the Priorist Party won by a single vote over the Inuktitut Party, and thus Kekap was appointed as the first president of the PAU. Since Sikorsky was definitely actually there, that is probably what actually happened. And that's the quote I've pulled for the event. But it is interesting to think about the fact that there's not a consistent narrative there. Next, on the 8th of January 2017, the first Arabian skirmish occurred. Araga gave independence to Astif as the nation of Arabia, since they wanted to reestablish that nation from the previous iterations of Earthworld. Thus, Arabia immediately declared war on Starum to regain some of their lost territory. After some considerable damage on both sides, FedEx decided to cede some of territory to Arabia to end the war. This was met with criticism in Starum, as it was seen as giving in to a much weaker power for essentially no reason. Here's the quote, basically what I just said. On the next day, January 9th, 2017, the second Arabian skirmish occurred between Arabia and Araga this time. The reason for this war isn't stated on the wiki, but it was very short. Arabia quickly invaded Vask and inflicted some small damage before ending the war. Presumably, this also had to do with Arabia regaining lost territory, but there's not really much info about this skirmish. So, as you can see from the quote here, that's pretty much the only line about it on the wiki. And this ends the coverage of 2017, which is definitely the most impactful year for this week. But yeah, we'll have to move on to 2018 now. From January 4th to the 10th, 2018, we have 3 different events, all occurring on the 4th during Distorted Europe Revived. First, the British-Hungarian conflict resumes. This war had started in December of the previous year, but an armistice had been declared and the fighting had ceased. However, a treaty had not been signed, so the war restarted at this time, as you can see in the quote. The British invaded Hungary, although losses led them to declare a second armistice, which led to a peace treaty between two sides, officially ending the conflict. The war was a minor victory for Britain, with Hungary giving over some resources and items to end the war, as the quote states here. The final event on the 4th also occurred in relation to Britain, as the last historic builds from the first Distorted Europe in Ireland were demolished on this day. Here's the specific quote going over the specific builds. And that ends our coverage of this week in 2018. We skip 2019 as nothing happened in that year, and we move on to 2020, where 3 events occurred during Solus World 2. The first one was that the world opened on January 4th. Not much to say about this. Land claims may have opened at the same time, but there is some information on certain wiki pages which claims that claiming actually opened a day later on January 5th. Unfortunately, the Discord archives are no longer accessible, so we can't verify either way, but I'm pretty sure claiming opened the 4th, with several nations formed on that day, including Grand Columbia, the Commonwealth of America, Sweeterland, Hotown, and the Caribbean Empire. These claims, start of the world, led to the Trinidad dispute intensifying by the 5th, when Grand Columbia successfully claimed the island of Trinidad in the Caribbean before Bonito Pibb, the leader of Leon, who had publicly stated they were planning on taking the island, despite their main claim being in Europe. This led to major arguments, and both sides planning for major war in the first week of the server, although that would be prevented by the week-long grace period at the opening of the world. Eventually, the dispute concluded, but throughout this week, many nations negotiated and prepped for a major war to start off the world. And that ends our coverage of this week in 2020. And that's the quote for that one. From January 4th to the 10th, 2021, 4 different events occurred across the week. First off, on the 6th, the Holland-Aragon War occurred. Both nations were pretty small, although Holland was widely respected in the international community. After hearing that Holland had lost a portion of its TNT reserves, Aragon declared war, hoping to gain a quick victory. However, the Hoish forces quickly defeated the small Aragonese army and forced a peace treaty after less than an hour of conflict, and basically no griefing on either side. Here's the quote. The very next day, another war occurred, the Fovrix Red Empire War, which was also very small and quick. Many foreign volunteers flooded to the side of the Red Empire, and they won the war within the day. Not a ton of info about this one because it was so small, so I'm not really sure the reason behind it. Here's the quote, though. Next, on the 9th, was yet another small war between the nation of Salt Lake City and Hainan. This war was notable at the time because Salt Lake City was relatively inactive in international politics and thus had no real reason to declare war on Hainan. However, after some damage on both sides, Salt Lake City would lose the war at the end of the day on the 10th and got annexed. This victory ultimately led Hainan down a path of inactivity, though, as they did not want to repair their grief structures, and they also eventually disbanded. Here's the quote detailing all of that. The final event for 2021 was on the 10th, when the Roman Empire was formed as a merger of several different nations in Europe, including but not limited to Holland, Holand, New Athens, Byzantium, and Denmark. Several different players wanted to try and claim the borders of the historical Roman Empire, and after major discussions with the staff team, managed to convince a lot of players to join together to achieve this goal. This experiment wouldn't go very well overall, but that is a story for another week. So now we move on to 2022. In 2022, during Brave New World, we had two events which occurred. First, on January 4th, the server closed, as I had announced previously. I don't really have a quote for this one, but I do have the other event where the world actually opened back up on the 5th of January. And I do have the quote I gave to announce this, which is here. Not exactly my proudest moment as host of Mappercraft, but there are definitely worse things you can do as the owner than release the world, make the world stay up unexpectedly. Not really anything that actually happened on the server for this week in 2022. For the final year here, 2025, last year during Ramayana World, this week was also pretty eventful. On the 4th, the Battle of Koth Yoga was fought as part of the Sayurgan Majapahit War. We were attempting to implement a new battle system for war on the server for this one, and although the battle itself was actually pretty fun, the scheduling and planning ahead of time were really not good for everyone involved. You can see that from the quote here. I'm glad this battle actually ended up happening, but I think overall it showed that a scheduled battle system wasn't really compatible with our player base and would have required a much larger amount of staff involvement than was acceptable. Thus, it was decided that after the battle, whoever won the battle would win the war, and future wars would use a different system to be decided at a later date. Thus, the next event on here is the Sayurgan Majapahit War ending with a Sayurgan victory after the Battle of Koth Yoga, after which they annexed all of Majapahit. Despite the quote from the Sayurgans here, nobody was really happy with this war. Basically, all the people involved eventually stopped playing. The Majapahit guys quit in anger at being invaded, while the Sayurgan victors felt that the server had kind of rallied against them unfairly and were annoyed that the war rules were being changed. In the next world, the war rules were adjusted and are in a much better place now, but this is still an interesting event in the history of the server. After the battle, on the 6th, Agnius 06 was named Emperor of Constantium, one of the larger nations on the server, which have frequently experienced internal turmoil. He wouldn't be coronated until a later date, though, but we can see the quote from the previous leader of Constantium, Carrot is a god. Finally, on the 9th, the region of the map available for claiming was expanded. Ramayana World was one of the few which only allowed claiming in a certain area of the map since it was so big. The claiming area was centered on the Indian Ocean, and thus it was expanded out into East Africa, Indochina, and Central Asia on the 9th. You can see this from the quote here from Sikorsky. And that concludes this week's episode. Longer one this week was pretty eventful across all the years. Remember to like, subscribe, and check out the server at the link in the description. As always, if you have any additional information about any of these events, leave a comment down below or go ahead and add it to the Mappercraft wiki. See you next week for January 11th through the 17th.